Sears was founded in 1892 by Richard Warren Sears. At its peak, the company employed over 350,000 people and operated more than 3,000 stores. It pioneered catalog sales, bringing a wide range of goods to rural America, and later, its department stores became a symbol of the American shopping experience. In October 2018, Sears filed for bankruptcy. The company that had defined American retail for over a century was gone in any meaningful sense within a year. The standard explanation involves Amazon and Walmart, the story of a legacy retailer unable to adapt to e-commerce and discount competition. This explanation is not wrong. It is also profoundly incomplete, because by 2005, when Eddie Lampert engineered the merger of Sears and Kmart, Amazon was already operating and Walmart was already dominant. Sears entered the Lampert era with full knowledge of those competitive forces. What happened between 2005 and 2018 was not primarily a story about Amazon and Walmart. It was not a natural market failure. It was the predictable outcome of a strategy that prioritized extracting value over restoring it. This specific mechanism, the one that most tellings of the Sears story skip over because it is more uncomfortable than Amazon One, is that Sears was systematically dismantled from the inside by its own leadership in ways that converted the company's assets into cash that flowed to the people controlling the company rather than into the stores and brands that could have made the company competitive. Understanding the specific mechanism in detail changes what you learn from the story entirely. Lampert was at one point simultaneously Sears's CEO, board chairman, transaction partner, landlord and banker. Each of these roles, individually, is legitimate. Their combination in a single person controlling a single company is what made the Sears story structurally different from a typical retail decline. In 2015, Lampert split off 235 of Sears's most profitable stores and 31 other Sears real estate holdings, selling them to a publicly traded real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties for $2.7 billion. The sale-leaseback deal had Sears paying Seritage rent on the use of the facilities it once owned. Lampert's hedge fund owned 43.5% of the Seritage Limited Partnership. He served as its chairman. Since 2015, Sears paid $349 million to Seritage in rent. So Lampert controlled Sears. Lampert caused Sears to sell its most valuable properties to Seritage. Lampert's hedge fund owned nearly half of Seritage. Sears then paid Seritage rent on the properties it had just sold. The rent payments transferred cash from Sears's operating budget to an entity that Lampert substantially owned. As Sears blew through its dwindling cash reserves, Lampert's hedge fund made loans to the company backed by the company's assets. That made him Sears's largest creditor. Sears owed him at least $1.3 billion. So Lampert was also the company's primary lender, at commercial interest rates, on loans backed by assets he had helped make available as collateral by virtue of being the CEO who made decisions about which assets to encumber. Countless articles have documented how Lampert used sophisticated financial tools to profit individually while the brand stayed mired in irrelevance. He found ways to pay himself through hedge fund fees of approximately $2 billion, $350 million in rent back to Seritage, and $400 million in interest to his hedge fund ESL on the very assets he owned. Have you ever seen an organization where the people controlling it had financial interests that were specifically served by the organization's decline rather than its growth? Leave a comment. While the company's cash reserves were being depleted through these financial maneuvers, store conditions deteriorated sharply. Former employees described buckets catching rainwater, malfunctioning escalators, and outdated point-of-sale systems that crashed during peak hours. The Sears pension plan was $1.5 billion underfunded at the time of bankruptcy, meaning the retirement security of the workers who had built the company across decades was underfunded, while the financial structures described above were generating returns to the controlling interests. Lampert had also installed 36 different management teams and boards inside each department, specifically to foster competition between them, to disastrous consequences. The organizational model, drawn from Ayn Rand's philosophy of rational self-interest, created internal competition between business units, that was supposed to drive efficiency. What it drove instead was an inability to make the cross-unit decisions that retail operations require. Coordinated marketing, consistent store standards, unified inventory management. Sears' most valuable assets weren't its products, they were its properties and brands. Instead of investing in retail revitalization, ESL Investments began extracting value. Kenmore, Craftsman, and Die Hard, brands forged over generations, became bargaining chips. Craftsman was sold to Stanley Black & Decker. Land parcels and store leases were transferred or liquidated. The brands that Sears customers had trusted for decades were sold off not to generate capital for reinvestment in the retail operation, but to service debt and extend the timeline of a company that was being systematically hollowed out. If this level of structural specificity, not Amazon one, but here is exactly how the value was transferred, to whom, through which mechanisms, is what makes this channel worth your time. The like is the direct signal. The 175,000 employees who lost their jobs when Sears filed for bankruptcy were not working for a company that lost a competitive battle. They were working for a company whose controlling shareholder had structured its affairs in ways that converted the company's assets into returns for that controlling shareholder, at the expense of the operating budget that would have been required to make the company competitive. This is a specific and important distinction. If Sears had failed because it genuinely couldn't compete with Amazon and Walmart, if the company had invested in the stores, the brands, the logistics, and the customer experience, and still lost, the lesson would be about competitive dynamics in retail. The employees would have been failed by a market shift that no management could have fully overcome. Sears did not simply fall behind the times. It was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but memories of what it had created. The people who bore the weight of that outcome, the store associates, the maintenance workers, the distribution center employees, had no access to the financial structures being built above them. They showed up, did their jobs, and watched the institution decline in ways they could see. The buckets catching rainwater, the broken escalators, the understaffed checkout lines, without understanding the financial mechanism that was producing the conditions they were working in. The pension underfunding is the most direct line between the financial engineering and the specific people it affected. Retirement security that workers had earned across decades of employment was not funded, while the interest payments on ESL's loans to Sears were being serviced on schedule. What the Sears collapse was really about, specifically as distinct from the general retail disruption narrative, is the specific conditions under which a company's governance structure can be used to transfer value from the company's operations to the company's controlling interests, without the transactions that accomplish this being illegal, and without the people most affected by the outcome having any meaningful visibility into what is occurring. The financial transactions described in this episode were disclosed in Sears's public filings. They were not hidden. They were available to anyone who read the company's SEC disclosures with attention to who was on which side of each transaction. The complexity of the transactions was real. Tracking the full scope of the related party dealings required significant analytical effort, but the information was public. The 175,000 employees did not read SEC filings. The customers who continued to shop at Sears did not read SEC filings. The community members whose property values were affected by the closure of the anchor store in their mall did not read SEC filings. The practical thing: for any organization where a controlling shareholder also controls the entities with which the company transacts, where the CEO is also the landlord, the lender, and the buyer of the company's assets, the question worth asking is not whether each individual transaction is at market price. It is whether the aggregate effect of all such transactions is to move resources from the company's operations into the controlling interest at a pace that the operating business cannot sustain. That question, asked of Sears's financial statements in 2010 or 2012, had a clear answer that the 2018 bankruptcy then confirmed. The next episode looks at a case where the value being created was going in the other direction, toward the organization rather than away from it, through a specific pivot made at the last possible moment. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.